Hi there, Dice Tales here. Better with Bacon made an interesting live stream. I guess it was about a week ago now, talking about the nature of horror. And one of his main theses is that it's impossible for a game to actually engender fear because the player themselves is not in any risk in a game. It is just a game. And therefore, fear, which is a physical, visceral reaction, is impossible to inspire just by threatening their character. And I suppose there's some truth to that. I would say that if you're engaged and immersed enough in your character, that some small level of fear for your character could be engendered, but it won't rise to the level of horror in and of itself, and I think he's right about that. So that leaves you the question, how do you do horror that's horrifying for players? And there's a couple of main ways that you see that done, one of which I try to use, and the other of which I think is more widely used. And the most widely used way, and you see this a lot in Call of Cthulhu, which of course is the most popular horror game by far, is you have the kind of slow drip build up that creates tension as players unravel the mystery around the horror, and you have little bits and pieces that hint at a greater horror, and you have this tension that builds up and builds up until you get to the climactic moment. And it's common in games, it's common in horror movies, and I don't like it. And I don't like it because you have the same problem in any media that you do that. You eventually get to the point where you have to relieve the tension, and the monster appears, and the cataclysmic horror manifests. And that is 100% a letdown. Every time. Why is that? It kind of harkens back to what Better with Bacon was saying. However that monster appears, whatever it does, however horrible it is, it's really not that horrible. I mean, you look at every horror movie you've ever seen, just about, there's maybe a couple of exceptions, and you don't see a very horrible monster. You just don't. It doesn't work. The horror, the big reveal, at least to me, and I think to many people, it's a disappointment. It isn't that scary. It isn't that horrible. It isn't that big a deal. I mean, let's be honest. Even in Call of Cthulhu, when old Tentaclepuss, Dread Cthulhu himself, makes an appearance, it isn't horrifying as much as the horror is gone, largely. So what do? Like I said, the slow drip, the building anticipation method is not one that I like to engage in. What I think that you have to do instead, and this requires immersion and role play, is that you draw the characters into the horror, and the horror is something that along the way hints at and relates to something that is also horrible to the player. A good model for this is the story Heart of Darkness. You're seeing along the way the inhumanity and the lack of humanity in people. And this is something you could bring into role play. And it starts out very innocuously with a French battleship firing shells into the jungle, which is obviously a futile act, while everybody on board is slowly dying of tropical diseases. And it progresses during the story. You see elements of behavior that point to an off-screen horrifying act or set of horrifying acts. And that's something that the player, not the character necessarily, but the player can relate to in the real world that is horrifying. And you build up the manifestation of those horrors in your game so that you're engendering in the players a real-life analog to that horror. In other words, your game calls out memories, experiences, past news events, possible life events that are genuinely horrible. And your horror points to those things. Your horror in your game tells you off-screen horrifying things are going on that people can relate to. Now you have to have some sensitivity and you have to have some self-censorship here, because you can easily go over some lines that nobody should cross in a game and are inappropriate. But there's plenty of scope on this side of it to point to unnamed horrors that are real horrors, so that the players are experiencing that horror. Even though you're not in the game having that happen, you're pointing to it off screen by the behavior that is in game and is horrible. And if you have a monster or a central big bad evil guy that is engaging in these horrors, you can show that without actually having it happen in-game, and you can get that sense of horror and dread that you need for good horror. It's not easy. I've only played probably, in a handful of games that have engendered that, and you could probably count them on the fingers of one hand, even if you used a chainsaw, where there have been really good horror. But that's the way to get to it that makes real horror on the tabletop that doesn't disappoint. Anyway, that's my take on it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and if you've ever experienced genuine, visceral horror in a game you've played in. I'd really like to hear how that happened. Thanks.